What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds for 120 days now, going up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through why most businesses fail to scale their systems and how I'm actively thinking about fixing this. So, ultimately, my reasoning and the way that I'm going to show this is basically going through layers. The problem there, which is ultimately identifying what is the key problem that ultimately is there, what are the problems that businesses ultimately face when they're needing to scale their systems, and what bottlenecks ultimately present themselves, and how that basically moves into the insights that we're then able to gain from this problem that we then are asking and then understanding from. So we're basically asking why and then getting different insights that ultimately allow us to move from insights into the different mechanisms that we can ultimately utilize, and ultimately that plays into the outcomes. So we're going to be going through each and every different layer, these 4 different layers, and how they all interact with each other. So if we start by the core layer, which is ultimately identifying the problem, we can see how most businesses try to grow, but they face 2 to 3 problems. They used the same tools as no one else, which ultimately results in them not having a competitive advantage. You can think about it, if every single business is using these same tools that you're using, what then becomes your competitive moat? What is the one thing that you can point out that ultimately allows you to then scale past the level that your competitors are at this moment? And then that ultimately allows you to then understand that by using the tools, that's not going to be your competitive advantage, but rather your competitive advantage is going to lie elsewhere. So then we're going to ask the question of where else does it lie, and then we're going to get a lot deeper into that when we move on to the mechanisms that we're ultimately going to pull. But then asking or understanding that operations are also fragmented. They also face data loss or leads drop off, simply because their systems and their processes are not built for scale. And then when they start scaling, every single thing breaks. And I think this is true, that when things start to go up, things break. But if you also take the approach of building the fundamentals in a manner that ultimately caters for that, then they break less. That ultimately they break less, essentially, that ultimately allows you to then predict what is going to break and how you're going to react and combat that into the future. But that also means that some of them face no automated workflows, so that ultimately results in team chaos. An example of this is you don't have an automated workflow in terms of how you're handling your leads, so your leads don't know what is the next step that needs to be taken. I've spoken about this in the previous video in terms of understanding how to manage leads and how to tell them what the next step is, which is also super important, as well as the internal team as well. You can look at it from your internal team, that hey, in our onboarding process, what actively happens after we've signed the client? How do they get taken from hey, we just reached out to this client, they've signed the contract, all the way to us fulfilling and then having that retainer? That ultimately comes as a result of trying to fully understand what this problem is. So this can be 2 to 3 of these problems that ultimately come as a result from this, that ultimately allows us to ask the question of what are the insights that we're then able to gather from this. And if we look at this, we then understand that scale isn't about more tools, but it's about the system's leverage. How can we leverage the systems in a manner that ultimately allows us to then repeat the same loops that we're actively running and the same processes in order to compete, in order to be make sure that the output is completely independent of you being there each and every single day. Basically asking the question of what can we do on a day-to-day that ultimately allows us to build that competitive mode that does not require me or there just manually inputting or doing things manually in a manner that ultimately does not allow us to scale in the long run. So we can see that this ultimately comes as a result from understanding what are the different things that we need to understand so that we can build these repeatable processes that create the output independently of what you're doing on a day-to-day. And if you're constantly doing things on a day-to-day, then you're not then able to scale scale that level of output that you can put into your business. Because if you're then able to scale the output in terms of outputting and ultimately doing a lot more without your direct input on a day-to-day, then you're then able to scale efficiently. But that ultimately means that we need to ask the questions, or basically ask from first principles thinking of asking, how can we basically map out this entire process, which ultimately comes to us asking or having this process where we identify the crucial business flows. Where are the critical points in our business operations that ultimately need us to map out, essentially? So then we ultimately are then able to understand what are the critical flows, and then from there basically mapping out how the humans also interact with these different flows, because the human aspect will always be a common denominator, and ultimately understanding this common denominator means that we're then able to introduce automation where the process repeats. If we're then able to understand where it is within the entire process where it repeats, then we're then able to understand where we can put or implement automations. Not basically just putting automations wherever and thinking that's going to solve all the problems, and thinking that the tools that we're going to be using are going to formulate the competitive moats that ultimately allows us to get ahead. But rather, how can we then structure it in the manner that we first identify what are the flows that are actively within the business, and then we map them out, and then from mapping this out we also understand how that interacts with the human aspect of it, how humans, your team interacts with them. Are they, do they have the level of clarity that ultimately allows them to get their job done in the manner that is also scalable? And also, can we introduce automation in this specific process where it repeats? Basically asking, is it even worth it to add this automation into this specific process where it ultimately repeats? And also measuring the outcomes, iterating and optimizing, which is the number one thing as well. To wrap this up, understanding that we need to be able to measure the outcomes. What are the outcomes telling us? And also iterate, basically be able to refine the process and make sure that we're then able to optimize. Because if we're doing neither of them, then we're just shooting blind, and we're never going to really understand what is working and why it's working as well. I think asking why is one of the most important things, because then it also allows you to move on to the mechanisms, the different mechanisms that you can then pull, which are ultimately understanding that tools don't matter, the levers do. Your pipelines means an automated follow-up sequence. Your dashboards means real-time visibility on KPIs. When we were building out dashboards, it was one of the most important things to make sure that we have all the mission critical metrics that are ultimately there, that ultimately allow our clients to see a overview of what is going on with their business, and from a fundamental perspective of, hey, this is what's going on today, let's see what's going on into the future. By giving them that high level insight, then they're able to then make decisions that are based on data, those different data points that we're ultimately able to pull from different sources, and then combine them into one specific dashboard that shows them their KPIs, that ultimately creates the competitive moat that allows them to then have that visibility in terms of their KPIs. But that also means that templates are also super important, basically standardizing the operations. Basically, without templates, then you're just doing or rebuilding, reinventing the wheel if you must, each and every single time. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to reinvent the wheel each and every single time. You want to make sure that if you've built one specific solution and you've tested and you've measured it and you've also optimized it as well, that you make sure that it works. And if it works, then you're ultimately able to then templatize it and then scale it onwards. Because the main mission here is ultimately building one thing once and then ultimately prepping it for scale. And with that, then you're able to then scale your level of output that you can basically have on a day-to-day and even on an hourly basis. And I think that is one of the most important competitive modes, especially when scaling. And then understanding that you also have notifications that ultimately reduce errors. Basically understanding that everyone needs to know what is going on, and they need to have context as well, because context is one of those things that in my opinion often gets overlooked in terms of building out things, that people may not fully understand the context of of what it is that they are doing or that needs to get done. So how can you then bridge the gap in terms of notifications, and how are you presenting those notifications to the team in a manner that is clear and also, actionable as well. But that ultimately means that, the meta principle from this is ultimately that the systems themselves become the mode, not just the software. Basically understanding that the system itself is your competitive advantage. It is the modes that ultimately gets you to get ahead of everyone else. And it's not just the software, it's not just a piece of software that you can have and then it's nice to have to use and all of that, but it ultimately serves a core function, which is ultimately, scaling the level of output that you have on a day-to-day basis or even an hourly basis, and if you want to go super granular, to a minute basis or even a second basis. Basically measuring each and every minute of saying, hey, how can I 10x my, what I'm inputting, and 10xing my output as well? How can I basically reduce my inputs so that I don't have that mental drag, and also that mental bandwidth is kept, protected as well? We can then look at the outcome, which is ultimately understanding that businesses scale properly when they reduced errors from the notifications and improve speed in terms of clarity as well. And this ultimately reduces the team autonomy. Basically, every single person does not have to be autonomous. They have to, ultimately understand that, they're reduced from the business, and they also, their level of impact is scaled, sorry. And ultimately you're then able to capture every opportunity efficiently and build long-term competitive advantage through the system and also designing it as well. And this is ultimately the outcome that we want to be able to get to by ultimately, peeling back the layers and fully understanding how these different layers interact with each other, by basically identifying the problem like I mentioned, and then having these insights that ultimately allow you to then understand, we need to map out, we need to make sure that we're identifying from its core how these flows interact with each other, and then also measuring these outcomes and how they also interact or, interact with humans as well, because humans are common denominators, in my opinion, that ultimately, are always going to be ever present. So how can you make sure that the systems and processes ultimately are able to be understood by the people that are doing the day-to-day work, and also understand how to scale that impact as well? So if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to check out my newsletter. It's the first link in the description, and also make sure to check out X, LinkedIn, Instagram if you want to connect with me. So it's been Fari, and I'll see you guys in the next video.